Hey art nerds, in my Sketchmarker brush review, I promised you guys a tutorial on overblending as well as how to do the rainbow hair. So this might look familiar to you guys. This is the Fieldtest that I use for the Sketchmarker brushes. So if you're interested in those markers, you can click the card here for that review. But I thought I would repurpose the Fieldtest and use this as an opportunity to walk you guys through my overblending technique and also demonstrate how to do rainbow hair as well as how to do colored line arts. So I'm going ahead and selecting the colors. The colors I'm using are Sketchmarker colors, but you can use the equivalent colors in any alcohol marker brand you like. And I'm using B64, BG54, BG93, G163, O25, O44, R34, R53, R115, V54, and Y44, as well as R122, V92, R63, BR13, BR24, and V112. And I didn't use all of those colors. So I'm also using a colorless blender. It's a Copic colorless blender. And like I said before, if you have comparable colors, any colors will work for this. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the overblending technique, and for that to work you need really thick thirsty paper. I'm using Strathmore mixed media paper. This is also a great technique for sketchbooks that have thirstier papers, as well as cellulose based watercolor paper. Now the gist of this is using a limited number of colors, you're going to be able to kind of achieve a wider range than you would if you just used your markers normally, because we're really relying on the white of the paper and the colorless blender to do a lot of our work for us. So the first thing you want to do is you want to apply a layer of the lightest color you're going to use. In this instance, I believe that would be R115 Daisy, which is a very, very light peachy color here. And I'm really only coloring mostly the shadow areas of the face. So underneath the hair, along the sides of the face as it curves away from the light source, the domino mask of the eyes, the side of the nose, underneath the nose, the lips underneath the lips, that. And I'm leaving a lot of the white of the paper, and I'm going to blend a lot of this back using the colorless blender, hence the overblending part of the overblending technique. Now, I do want to warn you guys, this can be marker consumptive. It can really eat up the inks of your markers, but it's going to give you a really soft watercolor-esque style, and it works well for people who have a more limited range of alcohol markers, because you're basically making your colorless marker and the markers you have do double duty. So in some of my other marker tutorials, like some of my Copic marker tutorials, I talk a lot about how you can get 3 tones of color out of each marker. The overblending technique really relies on those 3 tones. So that's one of the reasons we're going to want to work on a thicker, thirstier paper rather than a coated marker paper. This isn't going to work so well on a coated marker paper. So once we have our shadows blocked in, we're going to go in and add a lot of colorless blender, pushing that initial color back. So then I'm going to grab a nice peachy color. In this instance, I'm using R53, which is like a nice peachy rose. It's a really good color for adding blush to skin tone. And I'm adding blush underneath her nose, on her lips, on her cheeks, under her chin, and just above her eyes, as well as on the inside of her ears. And I'm going to blend that color back with our first color. So in this instance, it would be R115 Daisy. And I'm going to blend it back a lot because I want it to basically blend into that initial skin tone. And I'm going to slowly sort of build that color up. So I'm using R115 to kind of blend that color back. And I have some time-lapse tutorials here on the channel where I use Copic markers and Blick markers to do overblended art. I'll link those to help inspire you guys, and maybe you guys can pick up a few techniques from watching those. So I didn't mention this, but You don't have to start with a colored line art the way I did. You could start with like a black line art, but for the colorless marker style I'm using here, I do like to start with Color Eno Pink Lead, although almost any colored lead should work for this. So for my second layer of color, I'm going in with a darker color. We're going in with BR24, that would be flesh color in Sketchmarker. And we're just using this to further solidify our shadows. We're not trying to cover the whole thing. The whole point of using alcohol markers to build up contrast is each layer you color a little bit less than the last. So we're really using this to start building in our shadows and start solidifying them. And then in some areas where we want a softer shadow, a less harsh shadow, because shadows are either from direct light and then something blocking that light, that would give you a harsh shadow, or softer shadows are the form turning away from light in space. But we're going to blend out that darker color, BR24, with our lighter skin tone, R115 in this case. And you can use almost any colors you want for this. I have a tutorial where I show you how to do overblending techniques with darker skin tones using my character Naomi from my comic. So it's really just about really getting the most out of every color you can. So next I'm going in with R63 Indian Red, which in this instance is a kind of orangey red, and it works really well with the R53. I'm also starting to mark in some of the other things that are going to be colored in this image. So I mostly just used the R63 on her lips, and I'm going to add a little bit to her cheeks a little bit later on. So on the interior of her mouth, I used V112 Opera Mauve. You can use any dark red color that you like for this. I didn't have a dark red, so I used Vermillion and Opera Mauve for that. And now I'm adding a little bit of the Indian Red to her cheeks, and I'm going to blend that out a lot using the other blush color, R53. And that gives us kind of that softer blush transition. So my trick for really smooth alcohol marker blends is to work on really thick, thirsty papers and to just blend back, blend back, blend back. Whoa, what a tongue twister, with the color used previously. I also utilize wet into wet techniques as well as wet over dry techniques. So this is a lot like with watercolor, where if the paper is still saturated with your alcohol marker solvent, you're going to get a really smooth blend. Whereas if you allow your alcohol markers to dry first and then you apply another layer of color, you're going to get a more striking transition. And this kind of turns into what I mentioned earlier with our shadows, our harsh contrasting shadows, and then our smoother shadows. So if you want to use the overblending technique with darker skin tones or unusual skin tones, I recommend you start with a toned paper like Strathmore Tone Tan, and that way you're not working against the white of the paper, you're working with the color of the paper. So for the rainbow hair, we're still going to be using our overblending techniques, and we're going to use that to get a really nice smooth rainbow gradient all the way from yellow to a cool teal. So the colors I'm using here are Y44, O44, that's my yellow, and then my orange. Then I'm using R63, that's my Indian Red, although I might be using 122. It's a little bit difficult to see here. Then to get from that reddish orange to start getting to purple, I'm using V92, which is Figs, and it's this really nice kind of muted red violet. Then I'm going into V54, and then I start moving into my blue and my teal with B64 and G163. And the real trick here is to find transition colors in between the colors that you want. So we can't just go from yellow to purple and expect that to work. You need a lot of intermediate colors. You got to work your way around the color wheel in order to get that smooth gradient. And then the same with overblending, we blend back using the prior color. multiple times until we get the shade we want. So it's really about being patient and working with your markers for as long as necessary to get the results you want. And having them mapped out ahead of time, like you see I have them lined up to the side, allows you to work through this quickly, and you may want to swatch ahead of time. So I recorded this field test right after doing the unboxing, so I'd already been playing around with these colors and playing around with blending these colors and how I wanted to get from yellow all the way to teal blue. So I basically had those swatches done to begin with. But you can see here, I'm doing a lot of layering. So we started with our R63, our Indian Red, that red orange, and then I layered V92 on top of it, and I just keep moving back and forth, kind of adjusting the color as I go. And the colors are going to kind of mix on the paper. So one of the cool things about alcohol markers is that the way they blend is the solvent kind of reactivates the color, but it also pushes it towards the back of the paper. So you can really layer alcohol markers to get what you want. And then I go from V92 to V54, which is our cooler light purple, almost like actually I think it is actually periwinkle. And I'm really using the brushes on these markers. So when it comes to the overblending technique, a really good brush marker that has a really juicy ink flow that can keep up with what you're doing is imperative. You can't really do overblending with really scratchy markers, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do the overblending techniques with bullet or chisel tip markers. You're just not going to get the blending flexibility that you would with a good brush marker. And my personal favorite brush markers are the ones that feature the foam rubber brushes. You can achieve overblending techniques with some of the fiber brushes, like the Ohuhu brush markers are actually pretty good for this sort of overblending technique, but that's because they are incredibly juicy markers and they put out a lot of ink, maybe too much ink even. So saturating your paper is really important to this technique. That's how you're going to be able to blend back that color to push your original color further back on the paper and kind of soften it so that you can get that really soft transition of color. Now, if you're going to do rainbow hair like this, it really is important to have a good rainbow of color. Now, I'm very partial to pastels, but you could probably do a rainbow of hair color using neons, using really saturated primary colors, using jewel tones, but it's all about having those like red violets and blue greens, those middle ground colors that straddle two primary colors. So once we've put in a layer of V54, our coolish purple, we're moving on to our actual blue. This is a really nice light blue. This is B64 and it's kind of a sky blue. And this is going to allow us to transition into our teal, our G163 or pale turquoise. And you guys can see I'm not just coloring one section of hair in its entirety. I'm working from the top and working my way all the way to the bottom in sections bit by bit and blending back out that section and just kind of working with the paper while the alcohol ink is still wet. And one of the nice things about hair that makes this sort of rainbow transition really easy is that hair does have individual strands, so leaving some strokes still visible works in hair's favor. It makes it look more like actual hair. Whereas if we were doing someone who has a skin tone that's shaded kind of rainbow like this, we would have to work a lot more carefully. We'd have to work a lot more slowly to avoid that kind of streakiness. So I'm going to use a similar technique in the eyes, and I actually have a tutorial here on this channel where I show you guys how I do my quote-unquote anime eyes, and what I mean by that is just eyes that might have several unusual colors in them. So for example, the irises go from purple all the way to teal at the bottom, but we start with a base color of B64. This is kind of the color that ties it all together, and then while that's still wet, we dab in a little bit of our G163, our turquoise, and then while that's drying and our blue is still wet, we dab in a little bit of our V54, the Periwinkle, and then at the very top, our V92. And I even dabbed in a little bit of R34 Ice Pearl, which is a really cool pink color, just to kind of enhance that purple effect, since alcohol markers are translucent and you can layer them to get the colors you want. Now, since this is a unicorn girl and very fantasy inspired, I decided to give her multicolored freckles, just using some of the colors that I used in her hair and in her eyes. And of course, if you find any area to be too streaky or the color is not quite what you want, you're more than welcome to go back in and rework and refine the area. Like for her lips, I went in and added a little bit of R122 Vermillion, which is just a little bit darker. And I also added in a little bit of vermilion to her cheeks and then blended that out a bit. For the unicorn horn, I really wanted this to be more iridescent than it actually ended up. I started out with BG54, which is like kind of a green gray. That would be marble. And then I put in just a little bit too much of our G163 or our pale turquoise. I really wanted the chance to work more colors in. There is a little bit more periwinkle and a bit more of our steel blue at the top. If I'd left more space on the horn though, I could have really worked in some more pinks. So once your first layer of colors, once your first application of colors has dried, you can go back in and do another layer and get another tone of those colors. This is really useful for kind of creating more shadows or creating more refinement, like I'm doing here using it's either R63 or R122, so either Indian Red or Vermillion. It's probably Vermillion though. And I'm adding refining the orange, adding some more red to it, and also using this to help delineate the braids in her hair. Overblending is a technique that takes the concept of overworking your piece and is like, heck yeah, we're gonna overwork this piece. Let's see how far we can push it. How many colors can we throw into the hair or we can throw into the eyes? And it starts to become kind of an exercise in like trying to push it to the edge and then pulling it back or tying it together. And one of the ways you can pull it back or tie it together is by limiting your color palette like we did here. So we have rainbow hair going on, but they're all pastels. They're all very soft colors. There's nothing very intense about her hair, especially after the inks have had a chance to dry. See, if we had done pastels as well as intense colors, then maybe another way we could have tied this together would be to limit the color story to only pick 3 main colors and then work with tones based off of that. So we could do green, we could do yellow, we could do blue, and that would be it. And just to really hammer home the overblending technique and the rainbow techniques, I'm going to mirror this in her choker as well as in her hair bow. But we're going to keep the colors a little bit softer and a little bit more muted. So the choker, the main color story that I'm doing here is R53, so the color I'm applying right now, and it's more of a blush color, as well as R34, which is a cooler sort of pink. And then while those are still wet, I'm going to dab in some of the other colors and allow the colors to just kind of blend wet into wet on the paper. And this is one of the reasons why I really like using these heavier, thirsty papers that, yeah, they can be more prone to draining your markers, but you do get these really, really smooth blends and you don't have as many problems with streakiness. So it really kind of comes down to how you like to work and what your preferences are and what kind of compromises you're willing to make to get your art the way you like it to look. I do a lot of watercolors, so soft blends, diffused colors. That's important to me, and that's something I try to bring to my alcohol marker work as well. And one of the ways you can really kind of offset those soft blends to really make them stand out is to also have areas where there's a lot of contrast or where there's a sharp delineation between colors. So going in the exact opposite direction, with this hair bow, we started with R53, then we progressed to R34 with maybe a bit of R purple, our V54 in there, and then finally towards the edges, we're using B64. And another key to this overblending technique is to work fast. You want to apply your new colors while your previously applied colors are still wet and they're still very prone to blending. So I've got the bones of this finished. Now I'm just kind of going in and I'm going to add additional colors now that it's had a chance to dry, just to get a little bit stronger contrast. So for example, I applied V92, our Figs color, that red violet, underneath her chin to give us a more defined shadow. I'm also applying it to the interior of her ear as well. So on the irises of her eyes, I basically did what for the pupils of her eyes, I basically did what I did for the irises, but just with a different color story using yellows, oranges, and a little bit of vermilion. I'm also dotting in a little bit of our Indian red on the corners of her eyes. If you look in the mirror, you'll notice that the corners of your eyes do have this little pink area where the eyelids kind of meet. Sometimes I choose to show that and sometimes I don't. For such a big doe-eyed look, I thought it would work in its favor. And unusual for me, I trust these markers and their brushes so much that I'm actually doing her eyelashes using the markers themselves, which is something I don't normally do because I am queen shaky hands. And for this, I used our Periwinkle color, our V54, and then I used a little bit of the Figs color, V92, just to kind of shade it on the interior edge and the exterior edge, and to also kind of lightly sketch in the eyelashes. Now, as mentioned in the field test, this background is kind of cheap, but it really works in favor of this piece. It's kind of a hexagonal bouquet effect done by hand. I did something very similar in my Ohuhu field test. And what this does is it gives you a background. You don't have to be particularly clever about it or good at drawing to do this kind of background. So it's a great filler background, and what you make up for in technique, you sure are going to put in with effort. So I chose a lot of pastel colors, colors that maybe didn't get as much play or as much individual attention as maybe they would have deserved. So a lot of yellows, oranges, some of the peachy colors that weren't used, as well as the Ice Pearl color, which I really like, but didn't get used as much in her skin or in her hair. And it's basically just doing layer after layer of hexagons and filling them in and allowing the colors to blend optically. That's your eye blending the colors, as well as to blend on the paper itself. So you get some harsh edges, you get some really soft edges. And it's just a really easy background technique that looks better than the effort you really had to put in. So that about wraps it up for the marker portion of this tutorial. This is a twofer, so we could leave it like this. She's gorgeous as is. That's why we do the lineless style. But we're going to go ahead and ink this, and we're going to do some rainbow multicolored inking using Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens, and I'll link those down in the description below. I've talked about them many times, but I really like these. And they come in at least 10 colors. I think they're up to 15 now. So the key to this is to ink with colors that complement the area you're inking. So for example, at the very top of her head, on the yellow part of her hair, yes, there's a yellow Tombow Fudenosuke brush pen available, but I chose to ink with orange, just a little bit darker, a little bit warmer. Then for the orange part, I chose to ink with pink, just a little bit darker, maybe a little bit cooler since we're starting to get into shadows. For the purple, red, violet areas of her hair, I'm using purple, a little bit darker, a little bit cooler. For the blue and teal parts of her hair, I'm using blue, a little bit darker, a little bit cooler. So I think you guys can kind of get the gist. So when it comes to skin tones, you really have a lot of options, and it kind of depends on the piece that you're doing. So for someone who has a similar skin tone to our unicorn girl here, pink works really well. This is a really light, fun pastel piece. It's fantasy, it's a little bit silly. So pink is going to add a lot of vibrancy and liveliness. It's okay if the pink's a little bit too saturated, a little bit silly. It works in its favor. You could use orange if you were doing like a really sunlit piece where there's a lot of bright sun. You could use brown. That's going to be more natural. It's kind of a sepia color, and brown works for a wide variety of skin tones. You could use red, which kind of gives a liveliness to the skin, but isn't quite as bright and saturated and silly as pink. Or for darker skin tones, you can even do purple, which is going to complement the darker skin tones. It's going to contrast the darker skin tone really nicely, and it's going to be darker and cooler without being black. And of course, if you have a wider array of colors at your disposal, I mean, if you're inking with something different, then you can kind of choose something that's closer to the colors that you actually use. Like for skin tones, for example, if you were going to ink it in air quotes with Copic markers on top of whatever you've drawn or painted or colored it with, you could go just maybe 2 skin tones darker so it looks more like shadow, like a sepia or a burnt sienna color, rather than say something a little bit fantasy like pink here. So it really kind of depends on the piece you're creating and your goals for the piece. Now, one of the things that I really like about inking with colored inks is they do add a little bit of contrast, but they don't add as much contrast as, say, inking with black ink will. You can also kind of fine-tune your ink colors to match the objects you're inking. So when you're inking with just straight up black ink, you're adding a lot of contrast, and it can really deaden a very lively piece. And sometimes it can be used for that contrast, for that line art. It's part of the piece itself. It is designed with that in mind. But sometimes you don't want to do that. Sometimes you want to maintain the liveliness of the piece, and that's when colored line arts and colorful inks can really come in handy. Now, I really like brush pens because you get a variable line weight depending on the amount of pressure you put on it. And I am in favor of line weights like this or brush pens like this because it feels more lively. There's more life to those pieces. You can also ink using like technical pens or fixed width pens, or even fountain pens if you want to. Lots of people do that. And if you're inking with fountain pens, then you have a whole wide world of ink options to select from. But technical pens in general, if you don't go over them several times to kind of bolster the line weight, they have what I think of as like a dead line weight. It's a fixed line weight. A 0.8 is always going to be a 0.8. You can press harder and you might get a 1 millimeter out of it. You can be real light with it and maybe get a 0.5, but in general, it's always going to be a 0.8. Whereas with brush pens, you can get anywhere from really, really, really fine lines that are like 0.25 millimeters to 1 millimeter thick lines. And if you're working with a larger brush pen, you can get way thicker than that. And it just adds a lot of life and liveliness to it. Now, it doesn't work for every artist. You're not a bad artist or a lesser artist or anything like that. If you choose not to try brush pens or not to ink with brushes, it is simply your choice as an artist that you're making for the benefit of your art. You know your art best. But I happen to really like what brush pens bring to my art, and I like how accessible and how easy they are to use once you put in a little bit of practice. They do take getting used to. They're not a magic pill, but they are a lot of fun, and they're much easier to use and easier to tote around than, say, brushes. So if you've never used brush pens before, I really hope you'll give them a try. And if you're looking for brush pens that are marker safe and waterproof, the Tombow Photonosuke pens are pretty dang good. Now, you could have inked this piece before you markered it. It wouldn't be the lineless style then, but that is an option, and these are marker proof, so you know they could stand up to markering. And one of the cool things about colored line arts in that regard is once you start putting your marker colors on top of them, they actually shade the inks. They influence the ink colors, and it makes it blend together even better. So it's all about order of operations, how you want to handle your art, and what you want the end result to look like. So I really encourage you guys to play around and experiment and to try new things and to watch tutorials for inspiration. All right, so we have the inks done. There's just one more thing left to do, and that is to add some highlights with white gouache. Now, you don't have to use white gouache. You can use whatever white additive you like. You can use white gel pens. You can use glittery gel pens. You can use a color pencil. You can use watercolor pencil. You can use P.H. Martin bleed proof white. You can use whiteout, or you can use white gouache. It really doesn't matter. It's really up to you. Whatever you like using and whatever works best for you. I have a heck of a time getting gel pens to work, and even Poscas are sometimes finicky brats with me. So white gouache, while it does take getting used to, I know what to expect. I find it pretty easy to use, and a little bit lasts like forever. I'm still using a tube of Utrecht designer gouache I bought way back when I was at SCAD, and that was almost 10 years ago. So it's a pretty economical art supplies that can really last you a long time. And when I'm adding highlights, especially for something as like shoujo anime inspired as this, I'm going to add lots of highlights to the eyes. I'm going to add lots of highlights to the hair, although in this instance, not as many as I might since she already has very light colored rainbow hair. I'm going to add highlights to her choker and to the horn, and maybe even within the freckles, and little highlights on the lips and on the bridge of the nose, just adding in specks of light here and there to kind of break up the line art or break up some of the markering, and just to add a little additional light. So that about wraps this tutorial up. We talked a little bit about lineless marker art. I'll link some more videos down in the description below if you're interested in that. We talked a lot about my overblending technique. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll link some tutorials for that technique as well if you want to check it out. We talked about using colored line art and rainbow line art, and we also talked about rainbow hair. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Have a great day, guys. Bye.